The morning Rose Leland fired a warning shot over the heads of 3 men who had come to her father's ranch, with an arrangement she had never agreed to. The whole territory of New Mexico heard about it before sundown. It was the spring of 1878, and the land around Cimarron was still raw and honest the way only the high desert could be, with its red mesas cutting into a sky so blue it made your chest ache, and the Cimarron River running cold and clear through cottonwood groves that rustled like they were whispering secrets to anyone patient enough to stand still and listen. Rose Leland was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept in a loose braid down her back because she could never be bothered to pin it up properly, and brown eyes that held the particular kind of steady warmth that people confused for softness until she looked at them directly. She was not soft. She had never been soft, but she was not cruel either, and that distinction mattered enormously to her. Her father, Thomas Leland, was a good man in the way that men of his generation sometimes were, meaning he was honest about money and loyal to his friends, and deeply, genuinely confused about why his only daughter refused to behave like every other woman in Cimarron. He was 53, with white at his temples and a limp he had carried since a horse rolled on him 8 years prior, and he ran the Leland cattle operation with Rose's help, because without it the whole enterprise would have fallen apart in 1874 when her mother, Clara, had died of a fever that swept through the territory and took 3 other women besides. Rose had been 20 then. She had buried her mother, put on her father's old work trousers because her skirts were impractical for riding fence line, and got on with the business of keeping the ranch alive. She could read a cattle head count as fast as any man. She could negotiate with suppliers in Santa Fe without losing a single dollar to charm or to bluster. She could ride for 12 hours without complaining, and she could read, which was something she considered not a luxury but a right. And she read everything she could get her hands on: newspapers from Denver and St. Louis, novels, agricultural reports, land law documents, because knowledge, in her understanding, was the one thing no one could take off your shelf while you were sleeping. The 3 men who arrived on the morning in question were Harold Briggs, who owned the largest dry goods store in Cimarron, his son Edmund Briggs, who was 26, and had the sort of bland, pleasant face that suggested he had never once been inconvenienced by a difficult thought, and Harold's business partner, a man called Vance Dooley, who drove a buggy and wore a coat that was too heavy for the weather and who had done the talking while Harold stood behind him nodding. The arrangement, as Vance Dooley explained it with great ceremony on the Leland porch, was that Edmund Briggs would make Rose his wife, and in exchange, the Briggs family would extend a line of credit to Thomas Leland that would cover the back payments owed on the eastern pasture they had borrowed against 2 winters ago when the cattle prices collapsed. It was, Vance Dooley said, a very generous offer. Rose had stood on that porch with her arms crossed and listened to the entire speech without interrupting, which her father later said had given him hope. He should have read the particular quality of her silence more carefully. When Vance Dooley finished, Rose uncrossed her arms, walked back through the front door, came back out with her father's Winchester, aimed it at the sky directly above the 3 men's heads, and pulled the trigger. The sound cracked across the flat morning like a stone breaking. All 3 men stumbled backward. Harold Briggs sat down hard in the dirt. Edmund's hat blew off and he did not retrieve it. Rose lowered the rifle to her side. "No," she said, in the same tone she used when telling a ranch hand to move the water trough to the other side of the paddock. Her father said her name from inside the house, with the specific exhaustion of a man who had said it the same way many times before. "Thomas," she called back through the door, "they are leaving." They left. And by the time the sun went down, the story had spread from the Leland ranch to the Cimarron saloon to the post office and the dry goods store and the barber and the livery, gathering details it had not originally possessed, so that by nightfall some versions had Rose firing twice and threatening to reload, and other versions had her delivering a speech about women's property rights that lasted a full 5 minutes. And at least one version, told by the barber's apprentice, involved a second rifle. What was consistent across every version was the conclusion, spoken with varying degrees of admiration or exasperation depending on who was telling it. Rose Leland was too headstrong for any arrangement. She had heard variations of this her entire life. Too headstrong for a proper upbringing. Too headstrong to keep house. Too headstrong to be agreeable. Too headstrong for any man to take seriously. Too headstrong for any man at all. The women in town said it with a kind of regret, as if they were reporting on a chronic illness. The men said it with something that was either frustration or relief, depending on whether they had ever tried to do business with her or court her, and either way they ended by shaking their heads and looking at the middle distance as if the middle distance might have an opinion on the matter. Rose had decided, sometime around her 22nd birthday, that she was not going to perform the particular kind of diminishment that the word headstrong seemed to demand. She was not going to be less certain of herself, because certainty made other people uncomfortable. She was not going to pretend she did not understand things she understood perfectly well. She was not going to smile at Edmund Briggs and call it a good deal. What she had not decided, and what she thought about sometimes at night when the ranch was quiet and the coyotes were singing out on the flats, was whether there was a version of her life that included someone who did not require her to be smaller. She thought there probably was not. She was practical enough to have made peace with that, but she thought about it. 3 weeks after the incident on the porch, Nelson Sutton rode into Cimarron on a bay horse named Duke that had one white sock on the left rear and a philosophical attitude toward difficult terrain, and everything changed, though neither of them knew it immediately. Nelson was 30 years old, which he wore comfortably, the way men who have spent a decade working outdoors tend to age, not old exactly, but settled, like wood that has been properly dried and is done warping. He was broad-shouldered and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that were the color of sage after rain, and he had come to Cimarron because a man named Gerald Holt had written to him 4 months ago in Amarillo and offered him the position of ranch foreman on a cattle operation that was expanding its herd and needed someone who knew the land and knew cattle and could be trusted to make decisions without running back to the main house every 5 minutes to ask permission. Nelson had been a cowboy since he was 17, which meant he had spent 13 years learning the precise weight of silence and the precise weight of hard work, and the various ways the land told you what it needed if you were quiet enough to listen. He had worked 3 different outfits across Texas and New Mexico, had been trusted, had been good at his job, and had been fundamentally, quietly lonely in the way that a man can be lonely when he is competent and reliable, and no one around him is quite his equal in the particular ways that matter most. He was not a complicated man in his desires. He wanted land of his own eventually, a proper house, work that meant something, and a person to sit across the supper table from who would talk back to him with the same honesty he brought to every conversation. He had courted 2 women in his 30s, and both of them had been perfectly pleasant and perfectly unsuited to him, and both courtships had ended amicably with the mutual unspoken understanding that polite was not the same as right. He stopped at the saloon in Cimarron on his first evening in town to ask about Gerald Holt's ranch and its location, and the bartender, a red-faced man named Pete who had the social instincts of a town crier, told him about the Holt operation, and then, because he could not help himself, told Nelson about the Leland operation down the river valley, and specifically about Rose Leland, and specifically about the incident with the Winchester 3 weeks prior. Nelson listened to the whole story with his elbows on the bar and his glass in his hand. When Pete finished, Nelson said, "Good for her." Pete blinked. "Beg pardon? She didn't want the arrangement. She said no. She had a right to." Pete opened his mouth, considered several responses, and closed it again. Nelson finished his drink, paid, and went to find Gerald Holt's ranch. He met Rose Leland for the first time 4 days later, at the Cimarron trade post, where the small ranchers came to buy supplies and sometimes to argue with the owner, a competent and sharp-tongued man named Calloway who had been running the post since 1865 and had strong opinions about credit terms. Rose was arguing with Calloway about a shipment of wire fencing that had arrived 3 rolls short of what she had ordered and paid for, and she was doing it in the measured, precise way that suggested she had looked up the relevant invoice before coming, which she had, because it was folded in the breast pocket of her coat, and she produced it and laid it flat on the counter between them without theatrics, pointing to the specific line item with one finger. Nelson was waiting at the other end of the counter for Calloway to get to him. He was not paying attention to the argument initially, but then Rose said, "The law of contract does not dissolve because the delivery was inconvenient for you, Mr. Calloway," and Nelson looked over. Calloway was a big man and he was red in the face, and he was saying that the invoice was the invoice, but the shipment company had made the error and therefore it was not his responsibility, and Rose was saying in the same level voice that since she had made the contract with him and not with the shipment company, the responsibility remained his, and he was welcome to pursue the shipment company for the difference at his own expense, but he would first honor his agreement with her. Nelson watched this for another 90 seconds and then Calloway looked at him as though searching for a male ally and Nelson said, "She's right," and Calloway's face went from red to a sort of bewildered purple. Rose turned and looked at Nelson for the first time. He tipped his hat. "The contract's with him, legally speaking." "I know," she said. She was not rude about it, but she was clear. She did not need corroborating. She returned her attention to Calloway. Calloway, outflanked, agreed to make good on the missing rolls within the week and to absorb the cost himself. Rose folded her invoice, put it back in her pocket, and turned to leave. At the door she paused and looked back at Nelson. "I did not need the assistance," she said. "It was not hostile. It was simply accurate." "I know," Nelson said. "I said what I thought. I wasn't saying it for you." She studied him for a moment with those steady brown eyes that had the quality of taking actual inventory. "Fair enough," she said, and walked out. He thought about that exchange for the rest of the day, which was unusual for him. He thought about the way she had laid the invoice on the counter without drama. He thought about the line of her jaw when she was making her point. He thought about the way she had not thanked him, which most women would have done reflexively, and how the absence of the reflex made everything she did say feel more genuine. He asked Calloway who she was. Calloway told him with a great deal of feeling about Rose Leland and the Winchester and the arrangement she had refused, and the general consensus of Cimarron about her character. Nelson said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." Calloway looked at him the way Pete at the saloon had looked at him, with the expression of a man encountering a response that does not fit any available category. The second time they met was at the Cimarron River, 2 weeks later, on a morning when Nelson had ridden out from the Holt Ranch to check the fence line along the eastern boundary, where he had noticed a gap the week before. The gap turned out to be a section of downed wire, bent and tangled, and he was on his knees working it loose when he heard a horse coming along the other bank and looked up to find Rose Leland on a gray mare, riding the fence line on her own property, which ran along the opposite bank. She pulled up when she saw him. "The Holt foreman," she said, and it was not a question. "Nelson Sutton," he said. "I heard Gerald Holt had hired someone new." She studied the fence he was working on. "That gap's been there 3 weeks. Gerald's previous foreman was not what you would call diligent. I noticed. He got the wire loose and began reshaping it against the post. Your line looked clean over there. 3 loose staples between here and the cottonwood stand. I fixed them this morning." He nodded. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. The river moved between them, making its low, careful sound over the rocks. "Your name is Nelson Sutton," she said. "You came from Amarillo." "I did. You've been asking around." "I asked Calloway after the trade post. I like to know who I'm sharing a fence line with." "That's practical." "Yes, it is." Tilted her head slightly. You told Calloway I sounded like someone worth knowing. Calloway talks. Everyone in Cimarron talks. She did not seem bothered by it. Did you mean it? Nelson sat back on his heels and looked up at her. She was backlit by the morning sun, and the gray mare was still and patient beneath her, and there was something about the direct quality of the question, its complete lack of coyness, that made him feel more awake than he had in a long time. Yes, he said. I meant it. She looked at him for another moment, doing that inventory thing with her eyes. All right, she said. She clicked her tongue to the mare and rode on. He watched her go and had the strong, clear feeling that something had begun, though he could not have articulated precisely what, and would not have tried. Over the following weeks they fell into a habit that was not quite friendship and not quite acquaintance, the way rivers sometimes carve a channel without anyone deciding where the channel should go. They shared a fence line, which meant they crossed paths in the natural course of their work, and they were both people who took their work seriously, which meant the crossings were frequent. They talked about the land, about cattle prices, about the weather patterns that the old-timers said were shifting, about the quality of the grass on the south pasture, and the gopher damage along the upper ridge. Nelson learned that Rose had been managing the Leland operation substantially on her own since her father's health had begun declining the previous year. Thomas Leland was not dying, not immediately, but his heart was giving him trouble that the doctor in Cimarron said required rest and limited exertion, which meant that the man who had built the ranch from 120 acres to 400 was now largely confined to the porch and the bookkeeping, and his daughter was running the daily operations the way she ran everything, with thoroughness and without complaint. He also learned that the back payment on the eastern pasture was a genuine worry. The Briggs family's offer had been, underneath its humiliating terms, a response to a real problem. The pasture was mortgaged and the payment was due in the fall, and if the cattle market did not improve through the summer, the numbers were going to be very difficult. Rose did not tell him this in a spirit of confession. She told him because they were talking about the land market and the general pressure on small operations in the territory, and she was being honest, as she was always honest, about her own situation as one data point in a larger conversation. Nelson said he thought the summer prices might hold better than expected, because there was drought talk east of them that would reduce supply from the Texas operations, which would push prices up. He had been watching the weather signals and talking to a couple of drovers who had come through Holt's operation on their way north. Rose said she had read the same thing in the Denver paper 2 weeks ago. They discussed it with the seriousness of two people who understood that agricultural economics was not abstract but personal, not theory, but the difference between keeping what you had built and losing it. He admired this about her enormously. He admired that she had read the Denver paper. He admired that she had her own analysis and presented it as such, not deferring to his version, but engaging with it and adding to it and pushing back where she disagreed. She disagreed about the Texas supply reduction, thought he was overestimating it, and laid out her reasoning clearly. He listened and thought about it and said she might be right and he would reconsider his estimate. She looked at him with a slight shift in her expression, something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, as if she had braced for defensiveness and received attentiveness instead, and was in the process of updating her understanding of him. He noticed the look. "You're surprised I changed my mind," he said. "Most men don't," she said, "when a woman is the one who's changed it. I changed it because your reasoning was better, not because of who gave it." There was a pause. "I appreciate that," she said, and there was something real in the words, a weight to them, as if she had learned not to take such things for granted and was genuinely glad to encounter one. It was Gerald Holt himself who made things complicated, which was ironic because Gerald Holt was a decent man who was trying to be helpful. Gerald was 55, prosperous, well-liked in Cimarron, and he had decided, having hired Nelson and found him to be as capable as advertised, that Nelson deserved the full benefit of Gerald's local knowledge, which included the information that Thomas Leland was looking to take on a partner. Not a husband for Rose, Gerald clarified. A business partner, someone to buy a stake in the operation and provide the capital needed to clear the Eastern pasture debt in exchange for a share of the cattle returns. Good opportunity, Gerald said over supper one evening. Leland's operation is sound. It's the debt that's the problem. Man with the right capital could make a decent return. Nelson said that was interesting and he would think about it. What he thought was that he had been saving money for 7 years with the specific goal of eventually buying into or buying up a small operation, and that he had approximately enough saved, not comfortably, but enough to buy a stake in the Leland operation if the terms were reasonable, and that the Leland operation was exactly the kind of sound, well-managed, growing enterprise he had been looking for, and that he was in serious danger of letting his feelings for Rose Leland color his business thinking, and that he needed to be very careful about the order in which he proceeded. He thought about all of this for a week. He rode out to the fence line every morning and did his work, and kept his thinking private. At the end of the week, Rose came to the Holt Ranch to discuss a water access issue on the eastern boundary, a practical matter of a seasonal creek that ran across both properties and whose use needed coordinating during dry spells. She met with Gerald Holt at the main house to discuss it, and Gerald, having a full appreciation for the comedic potential of the situation, sent her out to find Nelson at the eastern barn when the conversation turned to the specific fence placement that Nelson was responsible for. Nelson was in the barn reorganizing the tool storage when she arrived, and the afternoon light came through the wide door behind her and turned the edges of her hair to copper. He had been thinking for a week about being careful about the order in which he proceeded. He had mapped it out sensibly. Business matters first, emotions entirely separate, nothing that could be misconstrued or that could make the professional relationship complicated. What he said was, "Can I ask you something personal?" She stopped. She looked at him. "That depends on what it is. Is there someone you're interested in town or anywhere else?" The silence was very complete. "No," she said. "All right." He set down the tool he was holding. "I want to be straightforward with you about 2 things, and I want to be clear that they are separate things even though they involve the same people." "Go on," she said. Her voice was careful. "Gerald mentioned your father is looking for a business partner, a capital stake for the Eastern pasture debt. I have money saved and I've been wanting to buy into a sound operation for years, and the Leland Ranch is a sound operation. I'd like to approach your father about it if you think that's appropriate." She was very still. "And the second thing, I think about you every day. I have since the trade post. I think you're the most interesting person I've met in a long time, and I like talking to you more than I like talking to anyone. And I realize it's not a proper declaration. I know that. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know, and because I want it on the table before we talk about anything else, so you understand where I'm coming from." The barn was quiet. Somewhere outside a horse moved in a paddock. The late afternoon wind came through the door. "Those are genuinely separate things," she said slowly. "You're not offering to invest in the ranch in order to court me." "No. The investment is a business decision I've been considering for a week based on the operation's merits. The other is entirely separate, and I would fully understand if you wanted nothing to do with it. What if the investment goes forward and I tell you the second thing is not something I'm interested in? Then I'm a business partner with your father, and I continue to be your neighbor on the fence line, and I behave myself." She looked at him for a long time. "You're a strange man, Nelson Sutton," she said. "I'm told I'm straightforward. In my experience, straightforward men are strange. Most men talk around everything and expect you to read their meaning. I don't expect that." Another silence, but this one had a different quality. There was something moving in it, some consideration she was working through, and he waited for her the way he waited for the land to tell him what it needed. "I am going to think about what you said," she told him finally. "About the second thing. I have been told my entire life that I am too headstrong for any arrangement, and I have come to believe that is not entirely wrong. I am not easy to be with. I know. You've known me 6 weeks. I know, he said again. I've been paying attention. She drew a breath. Talk to my father about the investment that I think is a good idea on its merits. The rest give me time. All the time you need, he said. He meant it without reservation, which was another thing that surprised her. She would tell him later. The absence of impatience. Most men, she said, gave you time the way they gave you rope, with the expectation that you would eventually use it to tie yourself to them. He had given it like it was actually hers. Thomas Leland received Nelson Sutton in the front sitting room of the ranch house 3 days later, on a warm Tuesday afternoon with the windows open to the spring breeze, and they sat across from each other at the small table where Thomas did his bookkeeping, and they talked business for 2 hours. Thomas was a thorough man. He asked about Nelson's background, his experience, his capital, his terms. He asked what Nelson expected from a partnership and what he understood about the operation he was proposing to buy into. He asked difficult questions and listened carefully to the answers, and at the end of 2 hours he said he would need a week to consider it, and he thanked Nelson for coming. Rose brought them coffee midway through the meeting and did not stay, but she caught her father's eye as she left the room, and he gave her a small nod that meant he was taking this seriously, which she had expected. Thomas Leland might not understand his daughter's refusal to be arranged, but he respected a man who came to him with numbers and spoke plainly about what he wanted and why. A week later, Thomas accepted the terms Nelson proposed: a 25% stake in the cattle operation in exchange for the capital needed to clear the eastern pasture debt plus a cash reserve for the summer operating expenses. Nelson would continue in his role at the Holt Ranch. Gerald had agreed to the arrangement with good humor, while taking on an advisory and investment role at Leland, with the understanding that as the partnership matured it might be renegotiated. Rose was present for the handshake. She stood at her father's shoulder the way she always stood when business was being concluded, as a witness and a party, not an observer. Nelson looked at her when the deal was made. She looked back at him with something new in her expression, something that was not the inventory look but was warmer than it, like a door that was not open yet but was no longer quite fully closed. That evening she walked out to the eastern pasture alone after supper, the way she sometimes did when she needed to think, and she stood at the fence line looking at the land that was now secure, that would not be taken from them, and she thought about Nelson Sutton. She thought about the trade post and the way he had said what he thought without performing it, without looking for credit for it. She thought about the fence line conversations and the way he had changed his estimate when she out-argued him, and the way he had looked when he did it, not embarrassed, not reluctant, just honest. She thought about the barn, the quality of his voice when he had told her he thought about her every day, the complete absence of manipulation in it, just a plain statement of a plain thing, laid out cleanly for her to do with what she would. She thought about what he had said about Headstrong. He had not said it directly, but what he had said was that he thought she was the most interesting person he had met in a long time. What he had shown, over 6 weeks, was that her certainty did not make him uncomfortable, that her knowledge did not diminish him, that her directness was, for him, not a problem to be managed but a quality to be engaged with. She stood in the evening light for a long time, with the cottonwoods whispering their low whisper and the mountains going purple in the distance, and the cattle moving slowly on the far end of the pasture, and she let herself feel the thing she had been keeping carefully to the side for the past 6 weeks. It was, she realized with some surprise, hope. Not the anxious, guarded kind, the real kind. She did not do anything impulsive with it. That was not her nature. But she stopped keeping it to the side and let it sit in the room with her other certainties, where she could see it clearly. She went back to the house and helped her father with the evening accounts, and when she went to bed she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought that she was going to tell Nelson Sutton something true the next time she saw him. She saw him 2 days later at the fence line, where he had come to walk the eastern boundary now that the legal encumbrance on it was cleared, and he wanted to understand what he owned a stake in. She was there ahead of him, which was her habit, and she was sitting on the top rail of the fence with her hat in her hands and her face turned toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains where the snow was still on the highest peaks. He rode up and dismounted and stood beside the fence and looked at the same mountains. "I owe you an answer," she said without preamble. "You don't owe me anything." "I know I don't owe it. I want to give it." She looked at him. "I've been told I'm too headstrong for any arrangement my whole life. I believe that the word they're using is not what they mean. What they mean is that I'm inconvenient for a certain kind of arrangement, the kind where the woman is a possession being transferred. And they're right, I am inconvenient for that, but I don't think that's all arrangements." Nelson was very still, listening. "I think you're asking about a different kind," she said. "I am," he said. "Then I want to try it, whatever that means with you." She looked at him steadily. "But I need you to understand that I'm not going to change. I'm going to keep running this operation the way I run it. I'm going to keep reading the Denver paper and arguing with you when your estimate is wrong. I'm going to keep being exactly who I am." "I know," he said. Everyone else said they understood that, and then they waited for me to become different. "I'm not waiting for anything," he said. "I'm not interested in you becoming different. I'm interested in you, the actual you, who you are." He paused. "I've been looking for someone like you my entire life, Rose, not someone agreeable, someone real." The mountains were very still in the morning light. "I am very real," she said. "I know." And then, quietly, "I think you might be the most real person I have ever met." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something she had never done in her adult life in quite that particular way. She smiled without any defense in it at all, without any assessment or measuring or holding back. Just a full, open, warm smile that transformed her face and made her look younger and older at once, like someone who has just been seen clearly after a very long time of being seen sideways. He thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He did not say that. He smiled back at her, steady and warm, and she nodded once, like something had been decided, and put her hat back on. They walked the fence line together that morning, both of them on foot, leading their horses, talking about the land and the grass and the summer prospects, and the conversation was exactly the same as it had always been, except that it was different, changed at the molecular level. The way water is still water after it becomes warm, but is not the same water at all. He stayed for supper at the Leland ranch that evening. Thomas Leland was on the porch when they came back, and he watched his daughter walk up from the pasture with Nelson Sutton beside her, and he saw something in her bearing that made him set down his coffee and look carefully. He had known Rose since she drew her first breath. He knew her the way a man knows the land he has worked for 30 years, not by analysis but by something deeper, some quality of attention that had become instinctive. What he saw was that she was not guarded with this man. For Rose, who was guarded with everyone because the world had taught her to be, this was enormous. He shook Nelson's hand at the porch steps with more warmth than the business partnership alone accounted for, and told him to stay for supper, and watched his daughter's face throughout the meal with a quiet feeling he could only identify as relief. After Nelson rode back to the Holt Ranch in the dark, Thomas sat with Rose on the porch in the comfortable silence they had shared most evenings since Clara died. "He's a good man," Thomas said. Rose looked at the stars. "Yes, he is. You look different." "Do I? You look like your mother looked when she made up her mind about something." Rose considered that. "I suppose I have." Thomas nodded slowly and said nothing else because nothing else was needed. Summer came over the Cimarron country the way it always did, with heat that built gradually, and the afternoon thunderstorms that swept in over the mountains in spectacular curtains of dark cloud, and made the dry arroyos run briefly with reddish water, and left the air smelling like wet earth and lightning. And the cattle grew fat on the good grass, and the market did better than even Nelson's highest estimate. Which meant the eastern pasture debt was not just cleared, but that by August The Leland operation had a cash reserve for the first time in 3 years. Rose and Nelson rode together on Sunday mornings, when both operations allowed it, heading out along the river or up into the foothills where the piñon and juniper grew thick and the deer moved in the early light. These rides began as practical things, checking the high pasture fence, looking for water sources, assessing the summer grass, and became something else, the way honest work between two honest people sometimes does. They talked about everything. They talked about the land and cattle and markets, yes, but also about the things that people reveal slowly to each other as trust is built. Nelson told her about his father's farm in East Texas, where he had grown up the oldest of 4 children, and how he had left at 17 not because he did not love his family, but because the land there had been broken, used up, and overplowed, the soil gone thin, and he had wanted to find land that was still whole. Rose told him about her mother, about Clara Leland's laugh and her practical wisdom, and the way she had taught Rose to read accounts at the kitchen table when Rose was 8 years old, treating it as no different from teaching her to cook, just another necessary skill for living. She told him about the loneliness of the years since Clara died, not in a way that asked for pity, but in a way that was simply honest, the way she was honest about everything. She told him that she had made her peace with the likelihood that she would live out her life running the ranch, and that this was not a tragedy, it was a life, and she had meant it. "I meant it when I made that peace," she said carefully, on a Sunday morning in late June when they were sitting on a flat rock above the river with their horses grazing behind them. "I want you to know that. I wasn't waiting to be rescued." "I know," he said. "I need you to actually know that, not just say it." He looked at her. "You built something real here. You kept it alive when it almost wasn't. You made decisions that men with twice your resources wouldn't have had the nerve to make. I know you were not waiting. I'm not offering to rescue you." He paused. "I'm offering to ride beside you. Those are different things." She studied his face for a moment with the measuring look and found what she was looking for and nodded. "Yes," she said, "those are different things." There was a family in Cimarron named Garza who had been in the territory since before the Americans came, since before the Mexicans came in their formal way, going back generations on this land, and their son Mateo worked on the Leland ranch and had since he was 21, and he was now 26, and one of the most reliable hands Rose had. Mateo's family knew the land in ways that Rose had spent 4 years learning from them. The seasonal water patterns, the old grazing routes, the places where the soil was poor underneath its green surface, the signs that the mountain weather gave before it turned serious. Mateo was also, Rose noticed, intensely interested in whether Nelson was a man of his word. Mateo had watched the men who came through the Leland ranch with business propositions and courtship intentions for 4 years, and he had his own accurate read on them. He watched Nelson the way he watched weather, patiently, without showing it, taking note. One afternoon in early July, when Rose was in Santa Fe for 2 days dealing with a land title question at the Territorial Records Office, Nelson rode out to the eastern pasture to check the cattle and found Mateo there already, doing the same thing. They worked together for several hours without much talk. They were both men who understood that work was sometimes its own conversation, and at the end of the afternoon, walking back to the horses, Mateo said, "You are not going to hurt her." It was not a question. "No," Nelson said, "I'm not." Mateo looked at him for a moment with the same measuring quality Rose had, though in a different register. "She has worked harder than anyone in this valley for 4 years. She has done it without complaint and without asking for credit. She deserves someone who understands that." "I understand it," Nelson said. "I see it every day." Another silence. "Good," Mateo said, and swung up onto his horse. Nelson understood, riding back, that he had just been told something important in the language of men who mean what they say and say very little. He had been told that this community around Rose, Leland, Mateo, and his family, Thomas on his porch, the 2 or 3 other hands who had stayed loyal through the hard years, had been protecting her in their own quiet ways, and they were watching to see if Nelson was someone they needed to protect her from or someone they could stand down for. He was moved by it, and careful with the responsibility of it. Rose came back from Santa Fe on a Wednesday evening, with the land title question resolved in the Leland's favor, which she had anticipated, but was nonetheless relieved to have confirmed, and Nelson was sitting on the porch with her father when she rode in. Thomas had taken to this in the previous weeks, Nelson stopping by in the evenings when his work at the Holt place was done, sitting with Thomas, who liked having someone to talk to about cattle prices and the old days and the state of the territory. It was good for Thomas's spirit, the doctor said, to have company and conversation within the bounds of his rest requirements. Rose rode up to the gate, took in the tableau on the porch, her father in his good chair, Nelson on the step with a coffee mug, and felt something expand in her chest that she was getting more comfortable naming. She unsaddled the mare herself always and came up to the porch brushing trail dust from her coat. Land titles cleared, she told her father. Thomas exhaled with evident relief. Good girl. Good legal argument, she corrected him mildly, but she kissed the top of his head. Nelson handed her his coffee mug. She looked at it, looked at him, and took it. That small exchange, the gesture and the acceptance of it, easy and unthought out, two people already fluent in each other's shorthand, was noticed by Thomas Leland, who said nothing and looked at the middle distance and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but was somewhere in the warm country between them, the place where you understood that the future was being shaped without you and that this was entirely correct. In August, the trouble came, as trouble in the New Mexico Territory in 1878 had a tendency to do, though from an unexpected direction. The trouble was named Fletcher Briggs, who was Harold Briggs's younger brother, and who had arrived in Cimarron from Albuquerque in late July with unclear business intentions, and the specific energy of a man who considers himself owed things the world has not provided. Fletcher was 43, wide and dark-eyed, and he had managed his brother's business interests in Albuquerque for 2 years before some unspecified disagreement had ended that arrangement and sent him north. He wore a pistol that he touched too often, which Rose noticed the first time she saw him in Callaway's trade post in early August, and he looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has been told a story about someone and is now comparing the story to the reality. She thought nothing of it that day. She had been looked at with that kind of attention before. What she did not know, what Nelson found out from Gerald Holt a week later, in a conversation Gerald had with the Cimarron sheriff, was that Fletcher Briggs had been quietly buying up land paper debt across the county. Specifically, he was approaching the holders of outstanding notes on small operations, mortgages, liens, back payment agreements, and purchasing the debt from them for cash at a discount, with the intention of calling the notes aggressively and acquiring the land when the small ranchers could not pay on short notice. The eastern pasture debt had been cleared, so the Leland operation was not vulnerable in that direction. But there was a lien from 1876 on the North Water rights, a small matter, $200, that Thomas had borrowed to repair the main well, and had been paying back slowly in quarterly installments with no urgency because the note holder, a retired merchant named Amos Perkins, had never pressed it. If Fletcher Briggs bought that note from Amos Perkins and called it in full immediately, $200 was $200 that the Lelands did not have liquid at the moment. Nelson brought this to Rose's attention on a Tuesday morning, riding out to the fence line to find her there before he had to tell himself she would be. He laid it out plainly, as he always did. What Gerald had heard from the sheriff, the note on the water rights, Amos Perkins, the amount, the timeline. Rose listened with her hat shading her face and her eyes on the mountains. When he finished, she said, "How did you find out about the water rights note?" "Your father mentioned it when we were going through the partnership books. I noted it at the time. You've been watching for this kind of approach. Since Fletcher Briggs rode in, yes." She was quiet for a moment. "The Briggs family is persistent." They're going around the front door now that you've made the front door expensive. Something moved across her face that was almost humor. Edmund married a woman from Taos in May. He seems happy enough. Then the almost humor faded. $200. $200. She did her calculations the way she always did, running the numbers against the current cattle income and the reserve and the upcoming expenses with the efficiency of someone who has been doing this kind of arithmetic since she was a girl. He watched her face as she thought. "We have 140 available without touching the operating reserve," she said, "if the note is called now." "I can put in the other 60, he said immediately. She looked at him sharply. "That's not in the partnership terms." "No, I'm offering it separately as a loan to you, not to the operation. You can pay it back when you can, or I'll call it next summer when the cattle go." "Nelson, it's $60, Rose, not a deed, not an arrangement, a loan between two people who trust each other." She held his gaze for a moment. "Is Amos Perkins likely to sell the note if Fletcher approaches him?" she said. "He might. He's old and he could use the cash. He doesn't know what Fletcher intends to do with it." Rose nodded slowly. "Then we need to get to Amos Perkins first." Nelson looked at her. "We go to him directly," she said. "We explain what's happening respectfully, fully, and we offer to pay the note in full ahead of schedule. $200 today if we can draw it. That closes the note and there's nothing for Fletcher to buy." Nelson stared at her for a second. "That's exactly right. I know. Shall we go now, or are you needed at the Holt place this morning?" He was already turning Duke toward town. They rode to Amos Perkins together, side by side, which was not an insignificant thing in the social grammar of Cimarron in 1878, but neither of them gave it the weight that other people would assign it. They were going to solve a problem. The problem required two people. Here were the two people. Amos Perkins was a small, white-haired man who lived alone in a neat frame house at the edge of town and received them on his porch with the courtesy of his generation. When Rose explained the situation, calmly, precisely, without embellishment or appeal to sentiment, Amos listened with the attention of a man who had been in business long enough to know when someone was telling him the truth. He said he had indeed had a caller the previous week, a Mr. Briggs from Albuquerque, who had offered him a fair price for the note. He had not yet agreed. Rose said she would like to pay the note in full today if Amos would accept it. She placed the mathematics in front of him without pressure. The original amount, the interest to date, a $5 premium for his inconvenience in dealing with the matter out of schedule. Amos Perkins looked at the money, looked at Rose, looked at Nelson, and said that he had always found the Lelands to be good people, and that he believed in conducting business with good people when he had the choice. He signed the note, paid in full, accepted the money, and poured them both a glass of water from his pitcher before they left. Fletcher Briggs arrived at Amos Perkins' door the following morning to conclude their conversation, and Amos told him the note had been settled, and there was nothing to sell. Fletcher was seen at the saloon that evening in a foul mood. He left Cimarron by the end of the week, apparently deciding that the county offered fewer opportunities than he had hoped, which the sheriff was relieved about and said so to Calloway, who told everyone. Rose and Nelson rode back from Amos Perkins' house that Tuesday afternoon in the golden late summer light, and somewhere along the river road Nelson said, "You came to that the moment you heard the problem. I've been navigating people's financial maneuvers against this ranch for 4 years. I know the shape of them." "You do." There was something in his voice that was not just admiration, though it was that too. It was something closer to wonder. Rose glanced at him. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "I've spent years working with men who couldn't think faster than their pride allowed them to. Watching you think is—" He stopped. "Is what?" she said, with a faint challenge in it, because she was not going to let an incomplete sentence stand. He looked at her with those gray eyes, the color of sage after rain, warm and direct. "It's one of the best things I've ever seen," he said. It was an unusual kind of compliment. Rose had received compliments about her appearance, about her cooking, which was adequate, about her writing, which was excellent, and about her father's cattle operation in ways that pointedly left her out of the credit. She had not received compliments about her mind delivered with that quality of genuine feeling. She did not know what to do with her face for a moment, which was itself unusual. "You are consistently strange," she said. "You have mentioned that," he said and smiled. The Cattlemen's Social in September was an annual event in Cimarron, held at the old Dunbar barn, which was the largest indoor space in the area outside the church, and it served as both a business gathering and a social one, which in the New Mexico Territory of 1878 were not always easy to separate. People came from the surrounding ranches. The Navajo traders from the north sometimes came, and the whole event had the particular energy of a community that worked hard and was glad, for one evening, to set the work aside. Rose had attended every year since she was old enough to come, first with both parents and then with just her father, and she had always arrived independently and left independently and danced when she felt like it and did not when she did not. And she had navigated the social arithmetic of the event with her usual combination of warmth and self-possession. This year she arrived with Nelson Sutton beside her, and this fact did not go unmarked. She wore her good dress, the dark blue wool with the cream collar, and she had her hair pinned up properly for once, though 2 or 3 strands had escaped by the time they arrived, and she did not bother to fix them. Nelson wore his good shirt and had actually gotten his hair cut, which she noticed. "You cut your hair," she said, when he arrived at the ranch house to ride over with her and her father. "It needed it," he said. "It looks good," she said, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything. He looked at her in her blue dress with her hair up and said, "You look beautiful," in the same straightforward tone. They stood on the porch looking at each other for a moment in the amber evening light, and Thomas Leland, behind them in the doorway, said dryly that they ought to get moving if they wanted supper before the dancing, and they both turned and were slightly embarrassed, which was charming and human, and made Thomas press his lips together against a smile that he was too dignified to display openly. At the social, the Cimarron community performed its various social functions. People who had done business together all year talked about it, and people who had not talked about the people who had. And the young men stood in clusters looking at the young women, and the young women stood in clusters pretending not to look at the young men, and the older people sat along the walls and watched all of it with the comfortable authority of people who had already made their various decisions. Harold Briggs was there, somewhat awkward given the events of the spring and the summer, but Harold was a man who valued social standing enough to show up anyway. He greeted Rose with careful civility, and she returned it with the same, because she bore Harold no special ill will. He was a man of his time and his assumptions, and she had said no clearly enough that no ambiguity remained. He was also, she noticed, slightly pale when he saw her standing beside Nelson, the two of them talking to Gerald Holt and Gerald's wife, who was a sensible woman named Martha who had taken an immediate and warm liking to Rose. Mateo Garza was there with 2 of his cousins, and his mother sat along the wall near Thomas Leland, and they talked together with the ease of long neighboring and shared history. Mateo danced well and did not lack for partners. Nelson danced with Rose twice, and the second time the music was slower, something the fiddle player found by accident and then liked and stayed with, and Nelson's hand was at the small of her back and she was close enough to feel the warmth of him, and she looked up at him, and he was looking down at her with that particular expression she had come to know, steady and warm and fully attentive, the way he was when he was listening to something that mattered to him. "I should tell you something," she said. "Now," he said, "during the dance, I find it easier to say things when I'm not standing still and staring at someone." "All right." His hand was warm at her back. "Tell me." "I think you are the best person I know," she said. It was simple and she meant it completely. "I think you are honest in the way that very few people manage to be. I think you have been good to my father and good to the operation and good to me without any of it being strategy, and I have been watching for strategy very carefully because I have been given reason to." "I know," he said, "and I think," she paused. They turned together in the slow movement of the dance. "I think I am in love with you. I am not saying that because I want anything from it or because I expect a particular response. I'm saying it because it is true, and I'm a person who tries to tell the truth when it is relevant." The music moved around them, the fiddle soft and sweet in the warm barn air. "Rose," he said, and his voice was different than she had ever heard it, lower and something in it that was almost undone. "I have been in love with you since you laid that invoice on Calloway's counter without a word of preamble and pointed to the line item." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That was the first week." "Yes, you said I think about you every day in the barn, and I thought that was forward. It was forward. I told you I'd been looking for someone real. I found her in the first 10 minutes and spent 6 weeks trying to be sensible about it." She looked at him steadily, the dance barely moving them now, more swaying than dancing. "I'm glad you were sensible. I needed the time. I know I would have given you all of it. I know you would have." She tilted her head. "That was part of why it worked." When the dance ended, they stood for a moment in the middle of the barn, and the people around them were already moving into new configurations and conversations, and Nelson looked down at her and said quietly, "Can I call on you properly?" "You have been calling on me for months, Nelson." "Properly," he said again. She understood what he meant. He meant formally, with intention named openly, which in 1878 in the New Mexico Territory was a thing that mattered not because of what anyone else thought but because it was honest, and they were both people who valued honesty in the structure of things. "Yes," she said, "you may." He walked her back to where Thomas was sitting with Maria Garza, and he shook Thomas Leland's hand, and Thomas looked at his face and then at his daughters and said, "Sit down then," with a warmth that indicated he had arrived at this moment before they had and was merely waiting for them to catch up. Fall came and painted the cottonwoods gold, and the river ran lower and cleaner after the summer rains, and the cattle went to market at prices that left the Leland operation firmly on solid ground for the winter and into the following spring. Nelson rode out to the Leland ranch every Sunday and most Thursdays, and stayed for supper and talked with Thomas, and sat on the porch in the evenings, and walked with Rose in the pasture in the late afternoons. And these walks were long, and the conversations were full and ranged across everything and nothing. The kind of talking that people do when they have found the person they want to talk to and are making good use of the fact. He proposed to her on a Thursday evening in late October, standing in the east pasture with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains behind him, going from gold to pink to the deep blue of the early dusk. And he did not go down on one knee because the ground was wet from a recent rain and the posture was not in his nature. But he stood in front of her and held both her hands in his and said what he meant plainly, because that was the only way he knew to say it. He said he wanted to marry her. He said he knew what he was asking, which was not for her to become someone else or to surrender any part of what she had built, but to let him stand beside her while she continued to be exactly who she was, and to stand beside him in return, and to build something between them that was as honest and as solid as the land they were both standing on. He said that he had been looking for someone like her his entire life, not looking consciously, but in the way that a man looks for good land, knowing what he needs when he has spent enough time working poor ground, and that he had found her here in this valley, fixing a fence line and arguing about contract law, and that he intended to be grateful for it for the rest of his life if she would let him. Rose stood in the fading light with her hands in his and looked at his face for a long time with the measuring look, and found what she had known she would find and said, "Yes, Nelson, I will marry you." He kissed her then for the first time, standing in the east pasture with the mountains going dark around them and the first stars coming out overhead, and it was a good kiss, warm and genuine and unhurried, the way everything was between them, the way it would always be. They were married in December of 1878, in the small church in Cimarron on a cold, bright morning when the snow was on the mountains, and the air had that crystalline quality of winter in the high desert, the kind of clarity that makes everything seem more itself, more real, more exactly what it is. Thomas Leland walked his daughter down the aisle, and his eyes were wet for the first time since Clara's funeral. But it was a different kind of wet, and Rose knew the difference, and pressed his arm with her hand as they walked, and he pressed back. Mateo Garza stood at the back of the church with his family, and his face had the expression of a man who has seen justice done and is quietly satisfied by it. Gerald Holt and his wife Martha sat in the third pew, and Martha cried openly and without apology, which she explained to Gerald afterward was simply because she had never seen two people look at each other quite like that during a ceremony, as if the ceremony was almost beside the point, as if the marriage had already been made in some more essential place, and the church was just a formality for the record. Gerald said that was very romantic, and Martha said it was not romantic. It was true. And Gerald said perhaps it was both, and Martha said yes, perhaps it was. The minister read the words that had been read over marriages for generations, and when he asked Nelson if he would have this woman and Nelson said, "I will," in his plain, direct voice, Rose felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as the final piece of a picture clicking into place, the last certainty adding itself to all the others she had built. When the minister asked Rose if she would have this man, she said, "I will," with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything, and she meant it with the full weight of a person who does not say things she does not mean. They did not have an elaborate celebration. They had supper at the Leland ranch house with Thomas and the Garza family and the Holts, and two of the ranch hands who had been there the longest, and were as close to family as employees can become. And the table was full and loud and warm, and the food was good. And someone produced a fiddle, and someone else had a guitar, and the evening stretched long and comfortable into the night. Rose and Nelson stood in the kitchen doorway at one point, both of them temporarily outside the main noise of the table, watching Thomas Leland hold court from his end of the meal with his good color and his good humor, and Nelson had his arm around Rose's shoulders, and she leaned into him easily, naturally, the way you lean into something that has become your geography. "He looks happy," Nelson said. "He is," Rose said. "He was afraid this wouldn't happen, for me." A pause. "So was I for a while." "But it happened." "Yes," she looked up at him. "Against all reasonable expectation it happened," he smiled. "Against all reasonable expectation." She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. They spent the winter together in the work and the closeness of it, two people who were well suited in the practical ways and in the deeper ways, and who discovered, as winter deepened, and they shared the daily round of their life, that the practical and the deeper ways were not separate things, but the same thing expressed differently. Rose kept running the Leland operation with the same thoroughness as always, and Nelson continued at the Holt Ranch through the winter per his contract, and they managed two operations from one household. They had moved into the Leland Ranch house, where Thomas had given them the larger bedroom and taken himself cheerfully to the smaller one, which he said suited him fine and had better light in the morning, and the logistics of it were substantial, and they handled it together. In February, Nelson and Gerald Holt sat down and negotiated the end of Nelson's employment at the Holt Ranch in a way that was good for both parties. And by March, Nelson was working the Leland operation full-time as a partner. This created a moment of adjustment that Rose had anticipated and Nelson had thought about, because it was one thing to be two people who shared a fence line, and quite another to be two people who shared a workspace and a decision-making process. And even people who are well-suited can find the lines of authority and ownership complicated when they are working in close quarters. What actually happened was that they were so honest with each other about it from the beginning that the complications dissolved before they could solidify. The first week, Nelson rode out to the south pasture and changed the feeding rotation without asking Rose, and she noticed it that afternoon and asked him about it, not with anger, but with the direct question of a person who needs to understand what is happening in her operation. He explained his reasoning. There was better grass coverage on the south side, and the eastern section was getting overgrazed, and she listened, and said he was right about the eastern section, but that she had been moving the rotation gradually to allow the north section to recover first, and she pulled out the rotation plan she had in her coat pocket because she carried her management plans with her. Nelson looked at the plan. "I didn't know you had a rotation plan this detailed," he said. "Because I hadn't shown it to you yet. I should have. Give me a day and I'll go through the full pasture management schedule with you so we're both working from the same picture. That would help." They did this, and from that point the operation ran on shared knowledge and shared decision-making, which meant they talked more than most couples in 1878 would have considered strictly necessary, and were both happier for it. Thomas Leland watched his son-in-law and his daughter work together through that first spring, and felt the satisfaction of a man who has seen the best possible outcome arrive. He told Mateo one afternoon, watching Rose and Nelson ride out together to the high pasture, that he had always thought his daughter would either find someone equal to her or no one, and that he was glad beyond expression that she had found the first. Mateo said that Nelson had understood from early on what he was dealing with, which was the most important thing. Thomas said yes, that was the most important thing. Spring of 1879 brought good rain and good grass and good cattle prices, and the Leland operation, now properly the Nelson Sutton operation. Though the sign on the gate still said Leland, because Thomas had not wanted it changed, and they had not changed, it expanded its herd by 40 head, and cleared enough in the summer market to begin building the cash reserve that would allow them to eventually buy the quarter section adjacent to the north boundary that had been for sale since its owner had given up on it 2 seasons ago. In June, Rose told Nelson that she was expecting. She told him in the evening, sitting on the porch after supper, with the moon coming up over the mountains and the cattle settling on the flats and the coyotes beginning their distant conversation. She told him the way she told him everything, plainly and with the full fact of it. Nelson was quiet for a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand, which was her left one, rested on her knee in the evening air, and held it with both of his. "Are you well?" he said first. "Yes, I feel fine." "Good." He was quiet again. Then, "This is the best thing I have ever heard." She looked at him. He was looking out at the mountains, and his face had a quality she had seen rarely stripped of its habitual composure, just openly moved, just human and glad. She squeezed his hand. "Good," she said softly. Thomas, when he was told the next morning, stood up from his chair, which the doctor had told him not to do quickly, and crossed the kitchen and held his daughter for a long time without speaking. When he finally stepped back, his eyes were bright. "Your mother would be so happy," he said. "I know," Rose said. Thomas shook Nelson's hand with both of his. The baby came in February of 1880, which made Rose's pregnancy entirely through the summer work, and the fall cattle drive and the winter preparations, all of which she managed with the same thoroughness and considerably more physical discomfort than she acknowledged, though Nelson noticed and adjusted things around her quietly, not by taking things from her but by being there, riding the longer miles himself when she needed it, handling the heavier lifting without performance. She noticed him doing it. "You're managing around me," she said one October morning. "I'm adjusting to circumstances," he said. "There's a difference." "Yes." "Managing around you implies I'm working against your involvement. Adjusting to circumstances means I'm accounting for the fact that you are growing a human being, and that is demanding on the body, and I can carry this particular fence post." She looked at him. "That distinction is important to you," she said. "It's accurate," he said. "And yes, it's important to me that you know the difference." She picked up the end of the fence post and helped him carry it anyway, and he did not argue because he knew her, and the distinction worked both ways. The baby was a boy, born in February on a cold, clear night when the stars were very bright, and the midwife came from town through the frozen dark, and Nelson waited in the kitchen with Thomas in a state of quiet that was not calm exactly, but was controlled in the way of a man who understands that some things are entirely outside his management and must simply be endured until they resolve. They named him James Thomas Sutton, James for Nelson's father and Thomas for Rose's, and he was a healthy, furious boy who announced his arrival in no uncertain terms, and continued to announce himself at 2-hour intervals for the first 3 months of his life, filling the ranch house with a sound that was somehow both exhausting and wonderful, which is the paradox of new babies that parents rediscover in each generation. Thomas Leland was delighted by his grandson in the pure, uncomplicated way that grandparents can be delighted, without the exhaustion coloring it. He sat in his good chair and held James for hours when Rose needed her hands, and talked to the baby with the seriousness of a man addressing a full-grown person, explaining the ranch accounts and the history of the land and the character of the cattle market with the full richness of detail he brought to any subject. Nelson watched this one evening from the kitchen doorway, Thomas at his chair with James against his chest, talking quietly, the lamplight yellow and warm, and felt something that was large and wordless and had no English in him for it, only the physical sensation of it in the center of his chest. Rose appeared at his shoulder, having come from feeding James, and looked at the same scene. She took his hand without looking at him. He held hers without looking at her. They stood in the doorway in the lamplight like that for a full minute, listening to Thomas explain the cattle rotation to a sleeping baby, and it was one of the best minutes of either of their lives. The years built themselves out of days and seasons and work and conversation, and the 1,000 small choices that constitute a life lived honestly between two people who have decided, every day, to be honest with each other. Thomas Leland had a serious episode with his heart in the spring of 1882, which frightened everyone and put him in bed for 6 weeks and then upright in his chair for another 8. And during this time, Rose and Nelson ran everything and also took turns sitting with him in the evenings and making sure he ate properly and that James, who was too now and mobile and energetic, did not tire him. Thomas recovered. The doctor said it was because he had the constitution of a stubborn man, which was accurate and which Thomas received as a compliment. By the summer of 1882, he was back on the porch in his good chair with his coffee and his newspaper, and the territory around him had changed. The railroad was pushing farther west. There was more settlement. The land was being argued over more intensively as the value of it became clearer. But the Leland Ranch with its 480 acres and its healthy herd and its cleared accounts was solid ground, and Thomas knew it, and the knowledge was a comfort. In 1883, Rose and Nelson bought the adjacent quarter section they had been watching since 1879, which brought the total land to just over 600 acres, and required a bank note that they negotiated carefully and paid on schedule and cleared ahead of time, because both of them were people who did not like to carry debt long. Mateo Garza, who had become the head hand with 3 men beneath him, helped them plan the new fence lines and the expanded grazing rotations with the thorough knowledge of the land that his family had carried for generations, and his input was treated as exactly what it was: expertise and important. The injustice of how Mateo's family's claim to this land, which predated all the American settlement and most of the Mexican formal settlement, had been erased by the layers of territorial authority above them, was something that Rose thought about and spoke about directly, which was unusual for a woman of her position and time. She could not undo what the law had done, but she could pay Mateo and his family what the work was worth and treat their knowledge as authoritative and make sure that, in the specific republic of the Leland Sutton operation, the Garza family's labor and intelligence were not rendered invisible. She did these things as a matter of course, and Mateo knew she did them, and it was part of why the loyalty ran as deep as it did. James turned 4 in 1884, which brought a second pregnancy and a spring delivery that went smoothly, producing a daughter Rose named Clara after her mother, a quiet announcement that made Thomas Leland leave the room for 10 minutes and come back red-eyed and dignified. Clara was a round, dark-haired baby with her father's gray eyes, and James, who had been suspicious of her for the first week, decided somewhere in the second week that she was acceptable and appointed himself her protector with the solemnity of a 4-year-old who has discovered a new purpose. Nelson, watching his son put himself between Clara's cradle and the ranch dog who had come inside to investigate, felt the same large wordless thing in his chest that he felt that night watching Thomas with baby James. And beside him, Rose made a soft sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, easy and natural, the way she had been leaning into him for years. Cimarron changed around them, the way western towns changed in the 1880s as the frontier became less frontier and more simply place, more settled, more ordered with more laws and more argument about those laws, the railroad changing the economics and the economics changing everything else. Some of the old ranchers sold and left. New people came. The territory was becoming something new. Rose and Nelson stayed and changed with it, because the land was theirs in the way that land becomes yours when you have worked it and loved it and buried people you love near it. They added a room to the ranch house in 1885 for the children. They put in a proper well with a pump in 1886 that took a significant investment but made the daily work lighter. They subscribed to 2 newspapers, one from Denver and one from Santa Fe, and read them both. Thomas Leland died on a quiet October morning in 1887, in his good chair on the porch with the mountains in front of him and his coffee half-finished beside him, and the newspaper folded in his lap. He was 62, which was older than many men in the territory got, and he had lived to see his daughter married and his operation secure and his grandchildren growing, which was everything he had needed to see. Rose was the one who found him, coming out onto the porch with her own coffee to sit with him before the morning work. She stood for a moment, knowing immediately, and set her coffee down on the porch railing, and went to him and took his hand, which was still warm, and sat beside him in the morning light for a while before she called anyone. The funeral was in the same church where she had married Nelson, and the community came, the ranchers, the townspeople, the Garza family, Gerald Holt and Martha, Calloway from the trade post who had long ago made his peace with Rose over the wire fencing, and considered himself a friend of the family in his bluff, practical way. The sheriff came. Old Amos Perkins came, slower than before but present and dignified. Nelson stood beside Rose through all of it, close and solid and quiet in the way that solid things are quiet, not absence but presence, the presence of something reliable. She cried once briefly, when the minister said Thomas Leland's name in the final prayer, and Nelson's hand was at her back and she leaned into it and came back upright and was steady for the rest. At home after, when the guests had gone and James and Clara were asleep and the house was quiet, Rose sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at the window. Nelson sat across from her. He was happy, she said, not asking. Yes, Nelson said. Genuinely. He was glad you were here. You gave him someone to talk to about the things he cared about. That mattered more than I can say. He was easy to talk to, Nelson said. He was a good man. Yes, she looked at the table. I feel like myself without him. I didn't expect that. I thought I would feel less. You were ready, Nelson said gently. Not because you didn't love him, but because you knew he was at peace. You saw it every day. She looked up at him. How do you always know what the true thing is? I learned to listen to someone who always says it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. All right, she said, after a moment. All right. They sat like that in the kitchen long after the tea was cold and the house was dark around them except for the lamp on the table. 2 people who had built something real together and knew it, who had found each other in a valley in New Mexico in 1878, and had not wasted a single day of what they had found. The ranch ran on through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, and the Leland Sutton name became one of the known names in the Cimarron country, known for running a sound operation, for dealing honestly, for the quality of their cattle, and for the particular fact that it was a partnership in the full sense of the word, that the woman who ran it was as much the operation as the man, which was still remarked upon, but was no longer exactly remarkable. Because everyone had seen it working for 15 years, and the territory had learned, in that direct way that the West had of testing things against reality, that it worked. James grew up knowing the land the way his parents did, learning it first from his mother, who taught him accounts and fence lines and cattle management with the same thoroughness that Clara Leland had taught Rose, and then from his father, who taught him everything about reading the land and the weather and the livestock with the patient attention that was Nelson's particular gift. James was a good student because both his parents were honest with him, and because honesty makes good students. Clara grew up curious and willful in the particular way that daughters of willful mothers sometimes do, which Rose handled with the combination of understanding and directness that she brought to everything. Clara wanted to read everything and ride everywhere and had opinions about the cattle rotation before she was 8 years old, which Nelson received with straight-faced solemnity and sometimes incorporated into his thinking, which made Clara look at her father with an expression her mother recognized as the beginning of the inventory look. Rose saw it and said nothing, and felt something complicated and warm. In the spring of 1892, Mateo Garza came to Rose and Nelson with a proposal of his own. He had saved money for 10 years and he wanted to buy a stake in the operation, a small one, whatever they thought was fair. He wanted to own a piece of the land his family had known for generations, even if the formal claim to it had been stripped away by histories he had not made and could not undo. Rose and Nelson talked about it for one evening and came to Mateo the next morning. The stake they offered him was larger than what he had proposed and at terms more favorable than he had asked for, and they told him why. Because he had been essential to the operation for 14 years, because his knowledge of the land was worth more than any number they could put on it, and because what was right and they knew it. Mateo looked at them for a long moment. He said, "I have worked for a lot of people in this territory." Rose said, "I know." He said, "I have never worked for two people I could say this to and mean it, thank you." Rose said, "You have given this land back to yourself. That is yours. We just made the paperwork honest." Mateo pressed his lips together for a moment and then nodded once, in the way of a man who has more feeling than words for it and knows the person he is talking to understands that. The summer of 1892 was a good one, and the fall drove the cattle at strong prices, and the Leland Sutton Garza operation, as it was now in the account books if not yet on the gate sign, cleared the year with a solid surplus. Rose and Nelson rode out on a Sunday morning in late October of that year, just the two of them, the way they had been doing for 14 years, along the river and up into the foothills where the cottonwoods were at their most golden, the aspen above them gone to yellow, the sky that particular deep autumn blue. They stopped at the flat rock above the river where they had sat and talked in the early summer of 1879, when they had been newlyweds and the future had still been mostly unmapped. The rock was the same, the river was the same, the mountains were as they always were, going gold in the late morning light. Nelson sat on the rock and Rose sat beside him, and they were quiet together for a while in the comfortable way of two people who have been quiet together many thousands of times. 14 years, she said. 14 years. Do you ever, she stopped. He looked at her. What? I was going to ask if you ever think about the life you would have had otherwise. But I don't actually want to know because I don't think about it myself and I don't have any interest in what might have been. Then why did you start asking? I don't know. 14 years makes you look back, she paused. What I actually want to say is that this, she gestured, taking in the mountains and the river and the valley and the ranch invisible beyond the ridge. This is the life I would have designed if I had known how to design it, the whole of it. He looked at her profile against the mountains, the auburn hair more silver at the temples now, the strong line of her jaw unchanged, the quality of her exactly as it had always been, steady and real and present. "Same," he said. She looked at him. "Same," he said again. "Every year of it. I came to Cimarron looking for good land and a good job, and I found those things and I found you. And every year since then I've thought the same thing." "What thing?" "That I looked my whole life for someone who didn't need me to perform a version of myself. Someone I could be honest with about everything. Someone who would be honest back." He was quiet for a moment. "I found you fixing a fence line. I've been grateful every day since." Rose looked at him for a long moment with the measuring look, and then the measuring look dissolved into the warm, open look that was its truer self, the one she showed him. "You were looking for Headstrong," she said. "I was looking for real. Headstrong turned out to come with it. Everyone called it a defect. Everyone was wrong." He said it with the absolute simplicity of a person stating an obvious fact. "Headstrong meant you knew your own mind, meant you didn't pretend, meant you would tell me the truth even when it was not what I expected." He paused. "Headstrong is what made every good thing possible, because a woman who performs what people expect of her, she can't build what you built. She can't be a partner the way you're a partner. She can't look at you across the supper table for 14 years and still be the most interesting person you know." Rose was quiet. "You're still strange," she said finally. "You've been telling me that for 14 years. I intend to tell you for another 40. He smiled, the full warm smile that had not changed since the barn on the Holt property in the summer of 1878, and she smiled back in the same way. The way she had smiled at the fence line when he had first said what he thought about her, the smile without defense in it. He put his arm around her on the flat rock above the Cimarron River, and she leaned into him with her shoulder against his, and they sat like that in the October light, looking at the mountains that had watched over this valley for longer than any human argument about it, older than ownership and older than borders and older than the language anyone used to describe them. The river moved below them, cold and clear. The cottonwoods were gold. The sky was the blue that only the high desert makes, a blue so certain of itself it seems to hold everything beneath it lightly and with complete confidence. Rose and Nelson Sutton sat in the middle of all of it, the middle of their own built life, and were exactly where they intended to be. They rode back to the ranch in the noon light, down through the cottonwoods and along the river road, side by side, their horses comfortable and easy on the familiar trail. And as they came over the last ridge, the ranch came into view below them. The house with its added room, the barns, the paddocks, the long fence lines running out across the pastures to the new quarter section, the cattle moving slow and heavy with good fall grass, and the smoke beginning from the kitchen chimney where James, at 12, had apparently started the lunch fire while they were gone, which was responsible of him. Rose laughed at the smoke. "He's going to be useful," she said. "He already is," Nelson said. "Clara will be more useful and more trouble." "She already is," Nelson said, and Rose laughed again. They rode down into the yard together and dismounted and unsaddled their horses and put them up with the ease of people who have done this 10,000 times, working side by side in the dim cool of the barn, their movements coordinated without discussion. When they came out into the noon light, James was on the porch looking at them with the serious expression of a 12-year-old who has done a thing and wants it acknowledged. "I started lunch," he said. "We saw the smoke," his mother said. "Good work." James absorbed this with the dignity of the praised and went back inside. Nelson looked at Rose in the noon light, the same light they had stood in 14 years ago when everything was beginning, and she looked back at him, and the whole of it was in the look everything that had happened and everything that was still ahead, the children and the land and the years and the work and the extraordinary ordinary dailiness of a life built honestly between two real people. "Come inside," she said. He followed her through the door. The ranch was quiet around them, full of the good things that had been built in it, and the mountain stood beyond the windows in the noon light, old and blue, and entirely indifferent to everything except the fact that the land endured, and the people who loved it endured with it, and the life that was made from honesty and stubbornness and clear-eyed love was the most durable thing of all.